This document remained classified for decades. It was not studied in schools. It was not quoted in history textbooks. It was read by analysts of the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States. Document number CIA-RDP. This is not a memoir, not a journalistic investigation. This is a dry analytical report written for people who make decisions. And the problem is that the content of this document, it doesn't fit very well into the familiar version of World War II history. An important clarification right away. This video doesn't attempt to justify any crimes. It doesn't cancel known historical facts, and it does not claim that one side was good and the other evil. Instead, we will do something that mass history rarely does. We will look at the war through the eyes of intelligence services, without slogans, without emotions, through documents, reports, and cold analytical language. If you ask most people what they know about World War II, the answer will be roughly the same. There was absolute evil. There was absolute good. There were victims, and there were executioners. And everything seems clear and unambiguous. This version of history is convenient. It is simple. It fits neatly into a textbook. But there is one problem. 20th century war is not only the battlefield. It is camps. It is millions of prisoners of war. It is propaganda. It is secret instructions that were never meant for the public. For an ordinary person, a prisoner of war is a soldier who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. For the state, a prisoner of war is a resource, a source of information, a tool of pressure, an object of exchange, and sometimes a problem that must be eliminated. This is exactly how intelligence agencies view prisoners of war, and that is why, after World War II, the CIA began systematically analyzing how different sides treated prisoners. The document we are discussing today was created at the very beginning of the Cold War. The United States no longer viewed the world through the lens of yesterday's allies and enemies. The world was being divided into spheres of influence, and the experience of the last war became a tool for future conflicts. Analysts were not interested in moral judgments. They wanted to know what works, what breaks people, which control systems are effective, and which are not. It was within this context that this report was created. When we hear the phrase CIA documents, we often imagine conspiracies, secret operations, and spies. But in reality, most intelligence work is the analysis of other people's mistakes and one's own experience. And next, we will begin analyzing the document itself. What exactly it describes, what conclusions the analysts drew, and which moments still raise questions today. Because sometimes the most interesting part of history is not what is written, but what is written too carefully. Before we go any further, it is important to understand what this document actually represents. This is not a political statement. It is not a moral judgment, and it is not written for the public. This report was prepared for intelligence analysts. Its purpose was not to decide who was right or wrong, but to understand how systems behave under extreme pressure. In other words, this document treats war not as a heroic narrative, but as a mechanism. To understand why the CIA focused so closely on prisoners of war, we need to step into the mindset of post-war intelligence agencies. Prisoners of war were seen as sources of operational information, indicators of morale, test cases for control systems, and long-term political liabilities. How prisoners were treated affected future loyalty, post-war stability, international reputation, and even intelligence recruitment for intelligence services. This was not a humanitarian question alone, it was a strategic one. The CIA report is structured in a way typical for intelligence analysis of the early Cold War period. It does not tell a story, it compares systems. The document examines administrative control, classification of prisoners, interrogation practices, labor utilization, and repatriation policies. What is striking is the tone. The language is technical, detached, almost clinical. Human suffering is not described emotionally. It appears as data points, summaries, and conclusions. One of the key features of this report is its comparative approach. The analysts were not asking, who committed more crimes? They were asking, which systems maintained control longer? Which approaches produced cooperation? Which ones collapsed under pressure? This tells us something important about intelligence thinking. Intelligence agencies study outcomes, not intentions. They focus on results, not public narratives. Some sections of the document stand out, not because of what they say, but because of how carefully they say it. Certain conclusions are presented with unusual caution. Others are followed by disclaimers or vague phrasing. In intelligence writing, this often signals incomplete data, politically sensitive conclusions, or findings that contradict official positions. These are the moments where analysts slow down, and so should we. Like many declassified documents, this report contains redactions, blacked out sections, missing names, entire paragraphs removed. Redactions do not automatically mean conspiracy, but they do indicate that certain information was considered sensitive, sometimes long after the war itself ended. And the question intelligence historians always ask is simple: sensitive to whom and why? Perhaps the most revealing part of this report is not its conclusions, but its omissions. Some topics are mentioned only briefly, others are summarized without detail. In intelligence analysis, absence is often as meaningful as presence. What is left unsaid can tell us as much as what is documented. This document was not written to reinterpret World War II. It was written to prepare for the next conflict. The early Cold War was a period of uncertainty. Policymakers wanted to know how populations react under control, how systems fail, how ideology interacts with fear. World War II was treated as a large-scale case study, and this report was part of that effort. At this point, we have not proven anything sensational, and that is intentional. What we have done is establish how intelligence agencies analyze history, cautiously, selectively, and with a focus on utility, not morality. In the next part, we will compare this CIA analysis with memoirs, independent historians, and other archival sources. And that is where the real tensions begin to appear. No intelligence report exists in a vacuum. Analysts themselves rarely trust a single source. They compare, they cross-check, they look for contradictions. That is exactly what we are going to do next. Because the CIA document becomes far more interesting when we place it alongside personal memoirs, post-war testimonies, and independent historical research memoirs are often dismissed as subjective. And they are. but they also capture something documents cannot: how systems felt from the inside. Former prisoners of war, officers, diplomats, and journalists repeatedly describe a gap between official policy and everyday reality. Procedures that looked orderly on paper often became chaotic, improvised, or brutal in practice. This contrast appears again and again across memoirs written by people on very different sides of the conflict. What is striking is that in several key areas, memoirs quietly confirm the CIA's analytical conclusions, not in tone, but in structure. Patterns described emotionally by witnesses appear as neutral observations in the intelligence report. Control systems that memoirs describe as dehumanizing are described by analysts as efficient or stable. The language differs. The underlying reality often does not. There are also clear points of divergence. Memoirs focus on suffering. Intelligence reports focus on outcomes. Where a survivor describes trauma, the report notes compliance. Where a witness describes fear, the document notes behavioral change. This does not make one account false. It shows that they answer different questions. After the war, historians attempted to create coherent narratives from chaos. They worked with incomplete archives, political pressure, and public expectations. In the early Cold War, certain interpretations became dominant, not only because they were accurate and would, but because they were useful. Useful for reconciliation, useful for alliances, useful for rebuilding societies. Some of the CIA report's implications sit uneasily with post-war moral clarity, not because they deny crimes, but because they complicate responsibility. They suggest that systems shape behavior, pressure reshapes morality, and individuals adapt faster than ideologies admit. These are uncomfortable conclusions, and uncomfortable conclusions are often softened, delayed, or ignored. These tensions matter because they influence how societies remember war. Memory is not only about truth, it is about identity. Nations remember what allows them to move forward. Intelligence agencies remember what allows them to prepare for the future. These priorities are not always aligned. When we compare documents, memoirs, and history books, something important happens. The simple story begins to dissolve, not into chaos, but into complexity. And complexity is not the enemy of understanding. It is the price of honesty. So far, we have not uncovered a hidden master plan. We have uncovered something more subtle, a pattern. In the final part of this video, we will ask the hardest questions of all. Why are some aspects of history emphasized while others quietly fade away? Who decides what is remembered and what is archived, footnoted, or forgotten? And what does all of this mean for how we understand the 20th century today?